Section C, Edexcel 2021, paper 2. Let's get started with the section C and more importantly get started with question 7. So, evaluate the effectiveness of quantitative easing during a significant recession. So, first impression sounds like a really good question. Let's have a quick read of the stimulus. So let's talk about the ECB, the European Central Bank, introduced a new round of quantitative easing in March 2020. Of course, very significant time period. What is that? First thing you should think about, anytime, whenever any stimulus mentions any date between 2020 and 2024, pretty much, what should the first link in your mind be? Of course, COVID. Since COVID, of course, very significant, and essentially one massive thing for your A levels and one massive difference from AS to A level is the degree to which you need to know real world application. And of course, you know, if you watch some of the previous past paper videos, there's literal questions that ask you refer to a specific industry of your choice, refer to an economy of your choice, refer to a developing country of your choice. Therefore, you will need to know detailed fact files, specific countries and specific sectors, and especially for macro. I believe literally if you're doing your exams after 2024, it's an absolute gem that COVID happened, since there's so many stats and figures, there's so many more macro stats where basically, since we went from a time of massively high inflation, went from a time of recessions to massively high inflation to stability again, it basically shows the entire business cycle, very recent, so very topical. So 100%, if you want those top grades, you need to learn the COVID stats and know them in massive depth. So they purchased up to 750 billion worth of assets, so created 750 billion worth of new money. What was the purpose of this quantitative easing? To reduce the serious risks to the effectiveness of monetary policy resulting from a significant recession. The ECB target for inflation remained at below but close to 2%. Since COVID, every year in live classes, I make sure to cover two main examples, which is one is the UK's, which I believe I've covered in a previous video, and secondly is the Eurozone. So Eurozone COVID and how it affected them, how it affected GDP growth, how it affected inflation rates, how it affected quantitative easing, things like monetary policy, fiscal policy. Absolute great examples. So let's go into a bit of a detail before we start this 25 mark question. So if you want to see what I'm answering in the 25 mark question, maybe skip ahead a few minutes. But a really great bit of real world application coming your way now. And I'm going to give you a brief overview, a brief summary of the Eurozone inflation, on how the Eurozone reacted / interacted with COVID time. So let's get started with the start of COVID, which of course was 2020. Now what happened in 2020? Of course, lots of economies around the world, most of the major economies around the world, introduced lockdown. What did lockdown do, and specifically how did it affect this famous AD formula? So of course, AD formula, C plus I plus G, X minus M. Two of the major components of the AD formula are what? So consumption makes up around 60% of AD, investment about 20% of AD. And how did lockdown affect those components specifically? Of course, with lockdown, we basically saw consumption fell off the face of the earth, where consumption essentially was just non-existent. Investment, if you think about things like animal spirits, essentially investor confidence, consumer confidence, massively decreased. Therefore, overall, how did that affect AD? AD massively decreased. And if AD is massively decreasing, if you think about it very simply, so price level, real GDP, if AD is continuously decreasing, how is that going to affect real GDP? Real GDP is going to continue to decrease. And what do we call when real GDP continues to decrease? Essentially is a recession. How do you define a recession? Is 2 or more consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. And let's link this all together. So when AD decreases from, we say AD1 to AD2, real GDP decreases from YE to Y1. And a reduction in real GDP is, of course, another word for reduction in real GDP is negative economic growth. And like I said, a recession is 2 or more consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. So therefore, first thing first, in 2020, what happened? We saw a minus 6.4% GDP growth in the Eurozone. Now, to give this some perspective, this is the worst in the Eurozone's history, the worst recession, the worst decrease in real GDP. Now, of course, for those of you who know a bit more context, of course, the Eurozone has only been around for about 26 years it is now, so like since 1999, but still very significant, and can add a bit more emphasis onto your context, saying it's the worst in Eurozone history. So now we've investigated what's happened to GDP, but now in 2020, in COVID, what is happening to the other axis, which of course is price level and the status on inflation. So we of course know there's two different types of inflation. There's cost push and demand pull, which help explain why inflation was so low during COVID times. But now we know that inflation AD is decreasing constantly. So AD is decreased from 81 to 82 to 83, and it keeps going. Now, how is that going to, of course, on the diagram, it's very simple. How is that going to affect the price level? Of course, there's no consumption in the economy, there's hardly any investment. AD is going to decrease. When AD decreases, as you can see, when AD1 decreases to AD2, what happens to price level? Price level decreases on PLE to now PL1, and of course this continued. We had the massive amounts of disinflation and 100% in COVID times, specifically in 2020. A massive thing the ECB, the European Central Bank, were really concerned about was deflation, where since inflation got so low, it got to 0.19% specifically. It got so low that they of course were risking, they were very close to the 0% mark, and when inflation of course drops below 0%, we therefore call it deflation. And especially on the UD Econ website, what do we specifically talk about? What are the risks of deflation? It can lead to a concept called the deflationary spiral, where deflation continues to occur, and basically you get into this everlasting spiral where you cannot get out of this deflation, and it totally ruins economies. It leads to real GDP massively decreasing, can really affect a currency, and of course this massive thing that economies really want to avoid. A really good case study there to study, just link that to, is of course Japan, where we call it the lost decade, where essentially they were fighting with deflation for several years, and of course had massive negative effects on their economy. But yeah, so in 2020, the Eurozone inflation was 0.19%. Main headline point there was the risk of deflation. So now, let's think about this. You are the European Central Bank. Even you as an A-level economics student, hopefully you'll know how to respond to this. So GDP is massively decreasing. You're in a massive recession. Inflation rates are extremely low. How do we respond to this? Of course, we would respond to this using expansionary policies. Why expansionary policies are trying to expand the economy, and they're used particularly when economies are in recession to help drive them out of the recession. And of course, that is what the question is referring to. How effective is quantitative easing, which of course is a component of expansionary policies, more specifically expansionary monetary policy. But yeah, and it's how effective it is during a significant recession. So all links together, and that's the reason why, of course, I'm teaching you this case study. So like I said, the ECB, the European Central Bank, would respond to this COVID shock using expansionary policies, and like I said, more specifically expansionary monetary policy. However, and what is the main component of expansionary monetary policy? Of course, is interest rates. So you lower the interest rates, trying to stimulate AD, thus stimulating the economy. However, this was the problem in Europe at the time, and the Eurozone at the time. The interest rates were already at 0% since 2016, and of course interest rates have a lower bound. You can't technically, well, at least for A level, you can't reduce interest rates lower than 0%. Therefore, the European Central Bank and the Eurozone were essentially quite stuck, that they couldn't move interest rates anymore. So what is the other component of expansionary monetary policy? Of course, that is the money supply side of things, which of course is quantitative easing. So they were almost backed into a corner, and they were forced to respond to COVID using quantitative easing, since they had no headroom left with regards to interest rates, since they were already at 0%. So since 2016, interest rates were already 0%. So therefore, when COVID hit, when this external shock hit, the ECB were forced to use quantitative easing. So therefore, they released their quantitative easing program. Initially, when it first came out, it was worth around 750 billion European euros, and it was called the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, and I'll refer to it as PEP. You'll see it as PEP around. And this was later extended later on as they realised COVID was a bit worse, and it ended up being at the end worth 1,850 billion euros. So of course, if you've watched the past paper video where we go through essentially the same thing, COVID timeline for UK, we went into a bit more depth with regards to the other policies like fiscal policy. But it essentially, if you're thinking about the demand side of things, it's a very similar route. So we have a recession initially, then we respond to the recession using expansionary policies. And what happens after that? What is the problem with a lot of these expansionary policies? What is the main evaluation for quantitative easing? And we saw that in 2022, where the Eurozone hit the highest ever rates of inflation. It hit a 10.6% inflation rate, which, like I just said, was the highest rate that the Eurozone has ever suffered with regards to inflation. And of course, if you've watched the other UK video, you will know that this inflation rate, yes, it is contributed to the expansionary policies, but at the same time, of course, there was the Russia-Ukraine war, which was massively contributing to it. So it wasn't just the demand side issues, it was also the supply side issues, which contributed to the inflation. But very simply, and I would just pick out, I think it's not too much to learn here. You can learn the whole thing, but try to at least, if you're, for example, a few days for exam, try to at least have the general timeline in your mind, which is very simple. Recession, massive decrease in real GDP, then they respond to it using PEP, whatever you want to call it, basically massive quantitative easing program. Around 1.85 billion was the total value, 1,850 billion was the total value of PEP, and then after 2 years, what did that lead to? The overall effect of these massive expansionary policies was extremely high levels of inflation, which we saw in 2022, a 10.6% inflation rate, like I said, highest the Eurozone has ever suffered. But yeah, that's a really good bank of real world application, but we will use this now in the question itself. But now, let's get back on with the question and back on with evaluating the effectiveness of QE during a deep recession. Let's actually address this question now. Evaluate the effectiveness of quantitative easing during a significant recession. So the way I'm pretty much going to structure this, give the examiner my points to say yes, it is effective, as it gives policymakers another tool, give as much application as possible, as like I said, these 25 mark questions, especially if you know a case study, use it as much as possible, try to drive your chain of analysis around the application, as if you can embed the application within your chain of analysis, but you're almost backing that chain of analysis, that theory, up with the real world examples. And that's exactly what the examiners want to see from the A-star students. So I'm going to present my point about that. Yes, it is an effective strategy, then slightly go into a bit of application, then explain the process of quantitative easing, and then show it on a diagram, a diagrammatic analysis of why it actually does help alleviate a recession. Let's get started with my point. And of course, the question itself is quite literally talking about recession. So it is quite clear which diagram is going to be appropriate here, which is, of course, we have time on the y-axis, real GDP on the x-axis, and we have a squiggly line and a straight line. And what do we call this? This is, of course, trade cycle, business cycle diagram, whatever you want to call it. And let's label this up. This diagram is an absolute gem, especially in evaluation. I really encourage in my life classes students to use this diagram as much as possible for this part of macro. So of course, in year 2 macro, you have the development side of things, and then you have this side, which is more like the policies, the government objectives. In the government objective side of things, this is always, of course, depending on the question, is usually quite appropriate, and it's a very good valuation point and can really help you, especially if you're evaluating, good theory and evaluation, but then also backed it up with a diagram. But let's get started with my point. So I believe quantitative easing is effective during recession. Why? How does quantitative easing help a recession? So it helps shorten a recession, doesn't it? Since we don't stay in a recession as long as if we didn't pursue quantitative easing. And also it reduces the risk of deflation. And of course, towards the end of stimulus, it talks about the inflation target from the ECB. And of course, we know from our own knowledge that during this time of COVID in 2020, that the Eurozone was suffering from the risk of deflation. So now that's my point. What is the paragraph structure? I always advise students, point, application, analysis, link back to question. Then of course, for these longer answer questions, evaluation at the end. The reason why, this is the biggest thing I emphasize about this paragraph structure, point should be short, clear, straightforward, but then always have application after. It does not matter if you know absolutely no stats. I'm telling you, you can think of something just from your real world knowledge, just from you being human, you interacting with the real world. For example, if I knew nothing here, no specific stat or figure, what could I say here? So quantitative easing, deflation. You could literally say, for example, the UK has suffered, or the UK has gone through a recession in the last 10 years. Do not think application has to only be something specific. It does not always have to be stats or figures. Any bit of application is better than nothing. Literally, for example, if I said, for example, the UK has suffered a recession in the last 10 years, even if I knew nothing about economics, I could probably guess that, and still, just slightly showing the examiner you have some sort of appreciation of the world of economics. You're not just mentioning theory, you're trying to relate that to the real world, and examiners will credit you, even if it is really limited. And of course, the better your application, the more marks you will pick up. But 100%, even if you do not know any specific stats or figures, try to use what you know, mold what you know to include application. And that's what you want. You want consistency. So whether you do 2 paragraphs, 3 paragraphs in your 25 mark questions, I want to see always point application. So you're consistently doing application, meaning that you can always maximize your application marks. And of course, for this, we learned the case study. And the example I'm going to give, E.G, the Eurozone suffered a minus 6.4 GDP growth in 2020, which of course was the deepest recession, the worst in the history of the Eurozone. Point is there, point is done, short, simple point, then application is done. What some students do, they try to incorporate the application into the chain of analysis. I would, especially when you're starting off, keep it simple, keep your application separate, now start your chain of analysis after that. Don't necessarily, if it comes naturally whilst you're writing your chain of analysis, you think of something, yes, 100%, but don't force it in. Just make sure, like I said, just make sure you're including your application. But let's get started with the chain of analysis. I'm not going to jump straight to quantitative easing, as I don't think it's natural right now. I'm going to start with a recession itself, since we were talking about recession. So I'm going to mention something like recessions pose problems for policymakers, and in this scenario the policymaker is of course the European Central Bank, the ECB. Why does a recession pose problems for policymakers? As of course in a recession, what are the components of a recession? I can add a little definition here: 2 or more consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. So we have negative economic growth, and usually if we want to show it on a diagram, negative economic growth, I probably wouldn't draw this diagram, but just for explaining sake, SRAS, of course, AD1, and then we have price level, real GDP, bing. And usually in a recession, the negative economic growth due to AD shifting inwards is coupled with deflationary pressures. Thus, the European Central Bank is forced, due to these deflationary pressures, as what is the target is below but close to 2%. And when it gets close to 0, of course, it becomes risky due to several reasons, like the deflationary spiral. But yeah, they're forced to respond to this deflation and this negative economic growth. Therefore, what do they usually do? Of course, they usually use expansionary policies. Since expansionary policies, of course, they stimulate AD, they stimulate the economy, therefore help get the economy out of recession, help get that negative economic growth, help stop that negative economic growth, and turn it to something positive. But of course, as we know, what was, and again, real application, absolute king here, what was the problem here with, because what's the main component of expansionary monetary policy? Of course, is interest rates. But as we know, since 2016, the interest rates in the Eurozone have been 0%, thus meaning that is the lower bound for interest rates. Therefore, they could not use interest rates as a tool to help stimulate the economy, as they were already as low as they possibly can get. Thus meaning quantitative easing is effective, as why it's a secondary tool. It's another tool we can use to help stimulate the economy within recessions. Now, since this question is linking a few topic areas like the business cycle, monetary policy together, I'm not going to give an extensive breakdown on QE, so I'm not going to give every single detail. I'm going to give like a brief overview to the examiner, just so I can pick up all the appropriate marks. If you guys want a full breakdown on the process of QE, I have actually covered it in another past paper. There's another paper too, just go and watch that, and it has much more details with the specifics of QE, as this will be negating a few details. So just a brief overview on QE. So for example, the European Central Bank are going to electronically create new money. They're going to use this money they have electronically created to buy financial assets. For example, this may be from commercial banks, this may be from high street banks. Now, if they buy banks' financial assets, this will therefore increase banks' liquidity, essentially the amount of money the bank has. And if the bank has more money readily available, if they have more liquidity, this gives them more incentive. They are more encouraged to give out loans, to lend, and for cheaper rates. Therefore stimulating AD, but let's think about what specific components of AD are stimulated. Consumption. So loans are cheaper, thus there's lower cost of borrowing. Therefore more consumers will borrow, therefore increasing consumption. Then of course for firms, investment, if there's lower cost of borrowing, there's lower repayment costs. This means firms will borrow more, firms will expand more, thus increasing investment. And these two, of course, consumption being around 60% of AD, will cause AD to shift out. And if AD shifts out, we can just flip this around. So from AD1 to AD2, what is happening? Real GDP is increasing, and of course, inflation, we get demand pull inflation, which is a positive, as of course, we are currently in a recession suffering from deflation, which of course brings us closer to the European Central Bank's target of below but close to 2%. And of course here, when I'm writing it, I condense the chain of analysis a lot. Try focus on what I'm saying rather than what I'm writing, since what I'm saying has a lot more detail. But of course, there's so many ideas, what I've said and what I've written. You can 100% split that into 2 separate paragraphs, and that will be more than enough. Like we've talked about how QE helps shorten a recession, how it still helps stop deflation, then the process of QE, how they increase banks' liquidity, how therefore increases investment within the economy as it encourages firms to invest, increase consumption in the economy. Then of course at the end we talk about demand pull inflation, economic growth. Of course, relay that to your diagram, show it on the diagram. Get those marks for the diagrammatic analysis. So now let's move on to the evaluation stage of the paragraph, and of course there's lots of evaluation here. So first and big evaluation point I want to talk about is of course the amount of quantitative easing used, as that is the main topic when we think about COVID, and especially the UK and of course Europe as well, where they probably, and they did, use way too much quantitative easing, and too much money was electronically created. So the way I'm going to word it is, however in evaluation, this depends on the degree to which quantitative easing was used. Or you can say the quantity of quantitative. As despite in the short run, quantitative easing helped us achieve our short-term macro objectives. So it helped us get us out of deflation, helped turn the negative economic growth to positive economic growth. However, in the long run, as we know, a few years later, when we learned about in the case study, it led to very high levels of inflation. And of course, so the word this evaluation point, I think it's a killer one, especially when you back it up with the application we know, since of course the ECB used 1,850 billion worth of quantitative easing. But the word it sounds very simple, but if you develop it right, it's an absolute top marker. So however, in evaluation, this depends on the time frame. As in the short run, quantitative easing helps us achieve our macro objectives, which are of course getting out of deflation, so inflation below but close to 2%, and then of course economic growth. It turns our negative economic growth to positive economic growth. But then, however, you can comment on the long run effects, where you can say, is it actually effective? As yes, it helps us in the short run, but in the long run, it essentially just creates more problems. As we know, in 2022, due to the heavy use of this expansionary monetary policy and specific quantitative easing, we saw massive demand pull inflation, and it could risk hyperinflation. As we know, in Europe, it led to 10.6%, which is the highest inflation rate has ever been for the Eurozone. And of course, within the UK itself, during 2022 to 2023, we saw 8 months of consecutive double-digit inflation. And one of the major components to this in the Europe and within the UK was, of course, the extensive use of quantitative easing. So you can really comment on the effectiveness. Yes, in the short run, it's quite effective, but we're solving a problem, but it just creates another problem later on. So is it really effective? So we go from a deflationary problem to basically a hyperinflationary problem. So 100%, it's a great one to comment on the effectiveness. And of course, a classic one we've been through several times is to do with just animal spirits, consumer confidence, and specifically since we've drawn this diagram, it works really well. And this is why I promote this diagram. It's really good for evaluation. So for example, the word is, however in evaluation, this depends on the stage of the business cycle we are at. As for example, as we use quantitative easing during a recession, and during recession, one of the main characteristics of a recession is, of course, low animal spirits, low business confidence, consumer confidence. Thus, it means that even if banks have increased liquidity and they are more incentivized, they lend at cheaper rates. Due to low levels of consumer confidence, low investor confidence, it means that consumers and investors will not actually take out more loans. Thus, it limits the degree to which increased consumption, increased investment, thus limiting the effectiveness of quantitative easing. And of course, for those of you who are seekers of the knowledge of economics, that has a good link to the liquidity trap. Now, I think I'm actually going to do a full video on the liquidity trap, as it is definitely the best evaluation point for expansionary monetary policy, especially if you can throw in the diagram. But yeah, for those of you who do know, liquidity trap is a good link there if you can link it in. But we won't cover it here since it's quite a high level evaluation point. But what you can do, if you want to link that to the liquidity trap, leave it in the comments and I'll try to get back to you. And another really good evaluation point, which is really embedded in the topic of financial markets. I understand most students really do not like financial markets, but honestly, if you want the A stars, you have to make sure you've revised everything, since financial markets has such good links to especially expansionary monetary policy and just put monetary policy as a whole. Therefore, if you're able to make those comprehensive, the holistic links, you can really pick up the top marks. But the main evaluation point there is kind of similar to the subsidies evaluation point from micro. So we say when we subsidise firms, that the government of course gives a grant to the firm, and that firm, as an evaluation point, you could say, however in evaluation, it depends whether that firm is actually going to respond, as that firm could basically just internalise that subsidy, so they could just take the money from the subsidy and not do anything with it. And that's kind of the same thing that banks can do. So when the European Central Bank buys high street commercial banks' financial assets, they could just use that to boost their reserves, repair their liquidity ratios, instead of using it to give out more loans, for example. So instead of using the money that they've gained from quantitative easing, that they've gained from the central bank buying their assets, instead of using that to increase borrowing, they could just use it to increase their own reserves. Therefore, of course, that would not increase consumption, it would not increase investment in the economy, thus rendering quantitative easing ineffective. So another great evaluation point, and I know this is probably the fourth one, but this is an evaluation point for this question. It might be a really good paragraph point for another total different question, maybe your exam paper. So I really want you to use these videos, as of course I have lots of ideas about economics. Use it to broaden your horizons as well sometimes. Some of these points you might not have heard, but use it, try to understand them, and you can just try to take some golden nuggets out of it. Any little thing that sticks with you and embed it into your own essays. But the evaluation point is specifically to do with demand side policies versus supply side policies. So quantitative easing is a monetary policy. Monetary policy, you should know, is a demand side policy. Now at A level, a lot of students don't actually know the difference. There are two demand side policies, which is of course fiscal and monetary policy. They affect primarily the demand side of the economy. And then of course we have supply side, which affects, so if demand side affects the demand side of the economy, so AD primarily, and then supply side policies, the primary impact, the primary effect is, the primary goal, is wanting to affect the supply side of the economy, which of course is LRAS. Now I'm going to take you down a bit of a rabbit hole here, so for students who are slightly low level, this might be complete waffle for you, but for the high level students, this should be really good. So, 2022, we're talking about Europe and the UK. So, around 2022, of course, like I said, in UK, we suffered with 8 months of consecutive double-digit inflation, and in Europe, as we can see, they had high inflation also. How do you think we responded to that? Of course, the next step in this timeline is that these governments, so the ECB and the UK government, pursued contractionary policies. So contraction monetary and contractionary fiscal policy. And of course, but what have I said with these two policies? They are both demand side policies, thus they affect the demand side of the economy. So AD, so they affect consumption, investment, government spending. However, the problem with this time period is that the high inflation rates were not caused by the demand side of the economy. And I want you to really understand that. The high inflation rates were not caused by the demand side of the economy. So it wasn't because we were spending too much, there was too much investment. It was a component, but it wasn't the main reason of this high, like 10%, the double-digit inflation. The cause of this massively high inflation was the supply side of the economy. And specifically in COVID, it was things like the Russia-Ukraine war, where we had like high gas prices, things like high oil prices, which led to, of course, if you've heard of the concept of imported inflation, if things are getting really expensive abroad and you're bringing that into your economy, you're importing that inflation, which is rising up the general price level within the UK. So specifically, things like supply chain shortages, like of course semiconductors, as you might have heard with cars and things like that. The shortage of semiconductors was of course rising the price, and when higher prices, we were importing them, they were of course causing more inflation in our economy. Then other things like, of course, like I mentioned, the energy bills. Of course, the Russia-Ukraine war led to much higher gas bills, and of course we were importing the gas. Therefore, that massive increase in price was translated as inflation in our economy. And if you think about the cost of living crisis, what was one of the major components of that? It was food price inflation. Food price inflation hit around 20%. Of course, this was partly due to the Russia-Ukraine war again. Things like grains, of course, due to the war, they became more expensive, less supply, therefore bid up the price, more expensive, and again, it was causing inflation within our economy. But essentially, inflation isn't just simply you need to think about inflation as two perspectives. That it can be caused by the demand side of the economy or the supply side of the economy, and of course that's a very simple way to put it in economics. So how does this link to this evaluation point? So the word the evaluation point. However, in evaluation, QE was not as effective during this 2020 or like this COVID period due to some of the problems were on the supply side of the economy rather than the demand side of the economy. As for example, let's think about the service sector. What was the reason why no one was spending in the service sector? So for example, on holidays, tourism, was it that no one had any money during COVID? No, it was that literally you couldn't go on holiday, that services were closed, and like things like shopping malls, just going on holiday. No one wanted to do it, of course, since there was a pandemic out there. So the problem wasn't availability of credit. The problem wasn't that people didn't have the money, and that's all we were doing during COVID. We were pumping, of course, with quantitative easing, with low interest rates. We were giving people money very freely, but very cheaply, you could say, at low cost of borrowing. But the problem wasn't that they didn't have the money. The problem was that it was physically constricted. Like, you just couldn't go on holiday. So therefore, you can say the problem was on the supply side of the economy rather than the demand side of the economy. And quantitative easing and these policies we were using are demand side policies that only affect the demand side of the economy rather than the supply side of the economy. As if you go back to our example, the UK, Russia-Ukraine war, it led to energy prices spiking, but then eventually what caused a drop in the energy prices? It wasn't demand side policies, it wasn't reducing interest rates, it wasn't quantitative easing, it was specifically just the UK diversifying its portfolio, getting oil from like the US, from Qatar, instead of getting it from Russia. Therefore, the supply side issue was fixed, meaning that we don't import a massively inflated price good, meaning that there's less cost push inflation within our economy. That is it for that 25 mark question. I think I love about some of these Edexcel questions, extremely skillful questions. If you know your application, you know your chain of analysis, you know your theory, you will absolutely smash that out of the park. And this is why some of my students consistently will score 23, 24, 25 on all the actual exam question papers, since the questions are skillful. And if you get a skillful question and you're a skillful individual, you'll score very well. So yeah, let's now move on to the second 25 mark question, which is question 8.